Hello, my name's Gregor. I'm Professor of Modern European History at the University of Southampton, and I'm the Director of the Parkes Institute for the Study of Jewish and non-Jewish relations. In this short film, we're going to be looking at the papers of Solomon Schonfeld, and in particular the section which relates to the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council. The council was instrumental in the rescue of Jews from Nazi persecution and murder from 1938 through to the 1940s and beyond. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Alex Maws from the Association of Jewish Refugees to help explore and discuss what's in these papers further. Alex, what can you tell me about Solomon Schonfeld's own background?
Well, Rabbi Dr. Schonfeld, as many people knew him, was born in London in 1912 to a family of Hungarian Jewish immigrants. They were a fairly religiously observant and Orthodox family. His father was a rabbi. And Dr. Schonfeld actually had planned to become a lawyer. He had a job waiting for him at the age of 18 in a London law firm, but his father passed away. And at that time, it was decided that it would be Solomon Schonfeld, his second son, who would take over much of the work of his father. So he changed the course of his training. He trained to be a rabbi. He went to Europe for a few years, and he came back to Britain to take on the work of his father, both as a rabbi, as an educator, as headmaster of a school, as the director of a network of Jewish schools. And then came the rise of the Nazis and the refugee crisis that the Jewish communities of Europe were experiencing in the 1930s.
So as you say, the refugee crisis hits, and the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council plays a leading role in galvanizing relief efforts. Can you tell us a little more about how that worked and what Schonfeld's role was?
Sure. Well, the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council was effectively just Dr. Schonfeld.
Okay.
It was really his pet project, I suppose. And from all accounts, he was a incredibly charismatic, resourceful, and uncompromising sort of character. When he wanted to get something done, it was going to get done. It's amazing that we're here to talk about his archive because, according to some sources that I've read, he was not a man who was particularly committed to leaving behind a paper trail. He was much more of a man of action. And so in the lead up to the outbreak of war after the Anschluss in Austria, he took it upon himself to find groups of Jews who needed sanctuary. He particularly at first was committed to people who worked in Jewish spaces, so rabbis, ritual slaughterers, people involved in religious life, and he found ways and found avenues to obtain visas for them to come to Britain. When the British government allowed for what became known as the Kindertransport, so this was the rescue of children, unaccompanied child refugees mostly from Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia. He personally organized some Kindertransport trains on his own back. And so he was responsible for the rescue of several hundred Jewish children. And one of the things that it's important to say about his efforts in that capacity in the lead up to the war is that, unlike other organizations that were just trying to get Jewish children from any particular background and place them in any type of homes or situations that they could here in the UK, Rabbi Schonfeld's priority, his commitment, was really to ensuring the continuity of Jewish life and Jewish practice. And so he made a particular effort to place children from religious homes into Jewish homes here in the UK to enable them to attend Jewish schools here in the UK, and that sort of thing. So that's what set him apart from many of the other relief agencies, of which there were quite a few, who came at this project from different perspectives. But that was his main priority in the lead up to the war.
And of course, Schonfeld's role wasn't confined to the Kindertransport, was it? Was it much?
No, not at all. I think if people know his name, he's probably associated most with being a key figure in the Kindertransport. But one of the things that I find most interesting about him is that his efforts to aid Jewish communities really extend across all the different range of experiences, not just that were impacted by the Holocaust, but really by the Second World War more broadly. He helped bring Jewish refugees from who were adults from professional backgrounds to the UK when there was an opportunity to do so. He helped to organize the kinder transports before the war. Once the war breaks out, he didn't stop, even though the kinder transports and most of the avenues for Jewish refugees to come to Britain were cut off at that point. He didn't stop his efforts. He still found ways of trying to aid those communities that were in Nazi-occupied Europe or in countries that had governments that were allied with the Nazis. He even came to the aid of the Jewish refugees who were already in Britain, but were then sent to internment camps as so-called enemy aliens. He found ways to help promote Jewish life and Jewish customs among British military personnel who were Jewish. Even after the war, when the popular conception is, well, the war is over, everyone who survived is safe and happy now. There's so much more to that story, and Schonfeld was a key player at that point as well. He went back to Europe. There's a famous photograph that many people have seen of him wearing a military uniform.
Yeah.
And they might wonder, well, what rank did he hold? Well, this was a uniform that he created himself. It was an entirely made-up uniform, but he knew that he was going to be going to a lot of DP camps and former Nazi concentration camps. And he thought it would be a helpful way for him to gain access to certain places. And so he went to the aid of people in those DP camps. He particularly helped to seek out Jews who were trying to return to their former communities in Poland, but were finding quite a hostile new environment that they were returning to. He went to find Jewish children who had been rescued and saved by monasteries and convents and things like that. Many of these children were so young at the outbreak of war or when they were sent to these spaces that they didn't even know that they were Jewish. But he would walk in, as one story goes, he walked into, I think it was a convent or a church, and he said the words, Shema Yisrael, that any Jewish child who had had a little bit of Jewish training would probably recognize, to see if any Jewish children would come out and recognize those words. And then he could, bring them to a Jewish environment, a Jewish home in Britain. So there's so many different ways in which people whose lives were impacted by the Holocaust, by Nazi occupation, by the Second World War, if they had a Jewish connection, it probably involved Rabbi Dr. Schonfeld trying to find some way to come to their aid in one way or another.
So we just got a few items from our very extensive Schonfeld archive. It was interesting that you said earlier that he was seen as a man of action rather than a person that keep material. But we have about 12,000 boxes of material.
That's amazing.
At least 400 or 500 of them relate to the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council. So he did actually keep a certain amount of paperwork.
I'm happy to be wrong about that.
No. And actually the CRREC material is one of the two real extant sort of archives related to Jewish organisations in the Second World War. So we're very grateful for him for his paper keeping in that. This is something from earlier in the early years of the work of the CRREC, and this relates to the work with Kinder in sort of 38, 39, and this is a letter produced by Chief Rabbi Hertz, which is given out to children. And I just thought I'd show it to you because it's quite an interesting one. It's in English and in German. It's sort of welcoming children, also telling them about things that they should know to make themselves fit in with society in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so fascinating. Hertz was actually Dr. Schonfeld's father-in-law, it turns out.
Yes.
And so it's interesting to see how, there's obviously a connection, a personal connection, but it can't help but wonder if they kind of look at the arrival of these new refugees from a slightly different perspective.
Yes.
This document, it's about the most British thing you could ever read. It says that, welcome, we're happy you're here. However, you need to know a few things about life in Britain, about, people here are very considerate and polite. There's a paragraph here about the importance of queuing, obviously, and being, quiet and gentle. And it shows a certain kind of uneasiness, I think, about the British community that was already in Britain prior to the 1930s, about the arrival of these new Jewish refugees. they sort of felt like, their place in society was, tenuous as it was, and they didn't want to cause any sort of a fuss or a disruption to it. And so while of course I'm sure they recognize the need to provide some sanctuary for these people in a time of need, of desperation, they also were a little bit nervous about it as well. And so they published this document that is, I've never seen the original one up close like this. It's great to have it right here in front of us. And it's of course in English and in German. It's important to remember that many of those arrivals, those young refugees in particular, they didn't speak any English when they got here.
Yes.
And what a shock that must have been for them to arrive in this was a strange country, obviously having just left their families behind, and then they're greeted with this set of instructions or guidelines or whatever we want to call it.
So obviously Schonfeld to a certain extent is known for his work with the Kindertransport, and we often think of the Kindertransport as pre-Second World War. But his involvement with the Jewish community and refugees obviously continued throughout the World War period. And one of the things that he was also involved in was the rescue of children and the transport of children from places like Poland in the post-Second World War period. So what we have here is two photographs which just illustrate this rather nicely. He commandeered a ship in 1946 to go over to Poland and gather together several hundred children to bring back on that craft. We have a lovely photograph here of it going under the Tower Bridge in London, and then we have some of the children on board the ship. So yeah, it was quite a fascinating story.
It really is. First of all, this photograph of the ship sailing up the Thames under Tower Bridge right into central London, just thinking about this group of Jewish children who had experienced unthinkable horrors arriving in that setting, it just feels it's a bit surreal and quite moving, really, to just see these photographs. And you look at this group of children here, I mean, you just can't help but wonder, each one, they're smiling, and yet, the fact that they're coming here unaccompanied, that tells you everything you need to know about what happened, presumably, to their parents and the rest of their families. So this is, on the one hand, it's a story, it's a photograph that depicts a brilliant moment of them finding, hopefully, a new home and a better life, but also each person in here represents, a very tragic story as well. But it makes such an important point as well. You mentioned the Kindertransport before the war, and many people think that the rescue of children it ended with the outbreak of war, and then we know everything that happened during the war with the Holocaust and everything that involved, and then we forget that there's history that happened after the liberation of the camps as well. It's the Holocaust didn't just end and then everyone returned back to their lives and lived happily ever after. We see here this photograph of people here who, as I mentioned, there's all sorts of trauma in their lives. They're arriving in a country where they probably don't speak the language. They're not familiar with the customs. Some of them are probably just about at working age. They may or may not have professional skills or training. They don't have a place to live. And so what's the story here? And this is something that's pretty special about Rabbi Schonfeld, and why we have a whole archive documenting his accomplishments, is that he's a person who did not forget that the needs of this community extended for years to come, and he continued to look after their welfare and their well-being in lots of different ways, both in terms of their religious life, which is something, as we mentioned earlier, he was particularly committed to, but just their general welfare as well. And you see here, this to me is sort of the beginning of a story, not so much, even though it's post-war, you think, oh, that comes at the final chapter of the story, but certainly not in the thinking of Dr. Schonfeld.
No, indeed. I mean, he thought, they had a future and they deserved a future.
Yeah.
This very much represents that work.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we've talked earlier about the fact that the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council was an organisation that was working for many, many years, for over a decade, rather than just being involved with work at the start of the Second World War. We have an annual report here from 1941, which to a certain extent illustrates very well the extent of the activities that they undertook there.
This is really interesting because, yes, we were talking about the full range of the different ways that he aided people across the sort of spectrum of different experiences. And we see here just in the sort of I guess this is like the table of contents or something at the beginning. So it talks about Jews in the forces. So this is in the British Armed Forces. He talks about clergy, refugees, internees. So this would have been Jewish refugees who came here through legal routes, but who were then, after the Nazi invasion of France and the Low Countries, sort of because of suspicions about enemy aliens, many thousands of Jewish refugees who had escaped from Nazism were then interned for fear of being sympathetic to the Nazis, and so he came to their aid. It talks here about children in hostels, organizing youth activities for them. This is really interesting. I don't think we even mentioned this one, the evacuation. So Jewish schools, usually based in London or other cities, who had to be evacuated because of the risk of the Blitz, for example, to remoter areas of the countries. He came to their assistance as well, looking after sort of the needs of Jews overseas in the British Empire. It's really amazing the whole range of different ways in which he came to the assistance of Jewish people in particular in lots of different circumstances. I think it's really important to point out that this is from 1941. People often talk about the Holocaust and the Second World War as being this period of a fog, of we didn't know what was going on and these sorts of things. And this is a publicly available document that shows just how much knowledge there was about the circumstances of different groups of people in different situations, and how it wasn't necessarily as clouded in secrecy as some people often assume that it might have been.
So the final items we have to look at really relate to continuation of the sort of range of activities for the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council, and really work that Schonfeld undertook for reconstruction and assistance to communities in what were formerly Nazi-occupied sort of Europe. And one of the initiatives, we were talking about him being a very singular individual, very determined. One of the initiatives that he led was the idea of creating mobile synagogues, which were sort of ambulances, which also doubled as synagogues, which they raised money for. I think the aim was to raise money for about 50 of them. I don't think quite made that many, with the idea that they'd send them out across Europe with the crews who would take supplies with them that provide succour to people in various camps or in communities that survived. And these are some photographs of the synagogue that made its way all the way to the south tip of Greece.
Yeah, is that the Acropolis there?
It is, yes.
It's amazing.
Yes.
Again, what an amazing photograph. I mean, this is from 1946. I mean, you just think about, obviously, so much of Europe was, in ruins at that point. But in particular, Jewish life was practically decimated in much of Europe. And when you think about those Jews who survived and what it was that they needed in 1946, obvious things come to mind. And for many people, in the immediate, months after the war, they were, practically in conditions of starvation. They had no money whatsoever. They had no homes. Most of them had lost their families. There are some very immediate needs that needed to be attended to, and there were many relief agencies that were dealing with that. Schonfeld obviously cared very much about that, but he also cared about something else that the secular relief agencies probably wouldn't have had at the top of their agenda, and that was the restoration of Jewish life and Jewish customs. And this idea of having these mobile synagogues is, what a brilliant solution to that problem. To just say, here we're bringing Jewish life to you wherever there are these little sort of fragments of Jewish communities that still exist. And it's a really moving concept that, to obviously a rabbi, to a religious Jewish person, he wanted to make sure that once the the basic needs of just human life, human existence were tended to, that we didn't collectively forget about something else that was lost. I mean, we have to remember that the Holocaust represents this rift, centuries of Jewish life, that thriving Jewish communities all across Europe, and that was largely severed as a result of the Holocaust, and he wanted to make sure that it didn't represent the end of those traditions, of that culture. And here we see the very beginning of those efforts. And I think it's worth noting that today Jewish life very much does still exist in Europe, in many of these places that the mobile synagogues would have gone. And I'm sure, it was of critical importance that it began as quickly as possible in 1946. And what an amazing document to highlight that.